boosting domestic demand is not going to increase export demand. So that's not going to affect that export demand channel. And the domestic demand, if it is not the constraint, if it is the constraint is supply, then this stimulus way of mechanically imitating what the Americans do or anybody else is doing and doing a Keynesian story makes no sense to me at all. So that's at least the stimulus was modest, not a great number, but this is one implication for what Larry Summers and others are pushing and are going to be pushing in the G20 meeting. They're asking for a 2% of GDP stimulus by almost all countries of the world for 2009 and 2010. Now, without thinking through whether it is the demand constraint or what constraint is operating in different countries, this one-size-fits-all recommendation seems to me to be utterly misconceived. But this is going to come up in the G20, and I don't know whether Indian Prime Minister will say this is not the right thing to do, but we'll see. The other, turning now to China. China is far more integrated than India, both financially and the real terms. The latest number that I have is about 70% of GDP is the share of exports of goods and services and imports of goods and services. So that's a major the story. So to that extent, that the external dimension is important. The external demand slowdown, and it has already taken place, significant shocks to exports in the Chinese case, and it's going to have an impact on the GDP growth. But unlike India, if you take in the gross domestic expenditure, the share of domestic consumption and the share of capital formation together, and I'm putting both private and public the consumption together, that share is much lower in China than in the case of India. So if you believe that by demand shifting, that the external demand is being affected adversely, now a shift towards shifting the expenditure towards domestic side, there is much more scope in the Chinese case. And so the stimulus packages of this sort that not only increases spending but also shifts spending in the expenditure shifting, if it can be done in the Chinese case, that has a much more scope. Now, on the fiscal side, China is in a far better position than India. The fiscal deficits even after the $600 billion worth of stimulus that was announced in October, that even taking that into account, the expected impact on the fiscal deficit is only 3% of GDP, total fiscal deficit. And so there is much more room in the Chinese case. China's fiscal system is doing well. Banking system is also, there are differences of opinion. If you take both the corporate sector, corporate governance, corporate sector in China and the banking system in China, there are those who view China's system as abysmal in both dimensions, and still abysmal in both dimensions. This is I forget MIT Kaosheng, I may not be pronouncing his name, and he has been writing this about China's financial system and the governance system and innovation being capacities being far less, and China using foreign investment as a substitute for the lack of FDI, as a substitute for lack of capacity at home to choose the right projects, to innovate, etc. That's one view. There are others like Heidel in the Carnegie Institution for International Finance who take a more sanguine view of the Chinese system. If the real situation is anywhere closer to the sanguine view, I think China is in a much better position to do the adjustment. And so the future outlook, the current growth projections compared to the 12%, 10% we had some years ago. Now the growth projection is 8% growth that was projected is no longer seen to be feasible. It's probably going to come down to 6 or 6.5%. So that's the range in China, as opposed to from 9% to a 5% in the Indian case. Now, the policy implications, this is the last thing I have taken too much time. One is I recommend the paper by Rogoff and Reinhardt, which was presented in the American Economic Association conference in January, which compares the current crisis in a historical perspective of financial crisis. And there are, in some respects, current crisis is worse. In other respects, it's on course compared to the historical averages. And so, to that extent, we shouldn't think this is the once in 2 centuries flood or once in 2 centuries crisis. And so you have to think in terms of new tools and new things to address. So that's not justified. And how soon the U.S. economy is going to come out of the recession? Already the emerging consensus is that the U.S. economy is going to turn around by the third quarter of this year. And the blue chip forecast is 0.5% growth in the third quarter of this year, 1.5% in the fourth quarter, and then faster growth subsequently. Now, on the other hand, every crisis from Obama administration on is viewed as an opportunity to push things which you otherwise would not have been able to push. So good ideas and bad ideas emerge out of the closet whenever there is a crisis. And more often, in my prejudiced view, bad ideas emerge from the crisis. And this is important because in response to short-term exegesis, you introduce reforms such as, for example, shifting the balance between markets and regulation in a way that forecloses or first increases the probability that a crisis of even worse dimension might arise in the future, and worse still, it forecloses options to address the future crisis should one arise. If the reform proposals of that sort are being made, then we will be doing a great service to humanity for the future. Now, some of the proposals, and the Europeans have a tendency for going in the radical direction, and the proposed change towards greater regulation does not seem to be consistent with the reality of whether you and the information flows and constraints, etc., that you would be able to exercise that regulation in a meaningful way to address crisis. And so this kind of thinking that this is the time we should rethink the entire system in a radical way, it will be inappropriate. But that doesn't mean the system doesn't need reform. And early warning system, etc., it is easily said than creating one, because what is a leading indicator or what is a lagging indicator itself depends upon what the system is happening. And I'm not too hopeful that a meaningful early warning system could be designed. And the major constraint in my view is all regulation is national. Most regulation is national, almost all.